Hello and welcome to the Dispute Resolution Board Foundation's Industry Update webinar on the new ASCE guidelines on geotechnical baseline reports. I'm Ann Russo, Executive Director of the DRBF. Our webinar series have become an essential tool to connect our members and share updates and ideas relevant to your practice. So we appreciate you joining us today. I invite you to say hello in the chat window and put any questions you may have in the Q&A box, and we will be sure to address those at the end of the session with our speaker. So it's now my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Randy Essex. He is a tunneling and risk management consultant with more than 45 years in planning, design, construction engineering, and disputes resolution services, primarily in the underground construction sector. He has a BS degree in geomechanics from the University of Rochester and 2 master's degrees in civil and geotechnical engineering from the University of California at Berkeley. He is a registered professional engineer in multiple states and a registered geotechnical engineer in California. He's been involved with more than 180 underground projects across North America and in 9 other countries. We were just talking about one he's working on in Canada. Among his 50 publications, he has led the development of 3 ASCE guideline publications on geotechnical baseline reports dating back to 1997. He's a member of the MOLS, the DRBF, and an honorary member of the Beavers, having received their Golden Beaver Award for engineering. So I'll turn it over to Randy to take us through today's session. Thanks, Randy.
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone on Valentine's Day. There's a partnering message in there somewhere, but perhaps we can leave that for another time. I'd like to, first of all, I've got to figure out how my slide system works. Here we go. So the topics I'd like to address today are, give you a little bit of historic perspective. I'm not clear how many people on the call know the nitty-gritty of geotechnical baseline reports, but how they evolved is an interesting story. Talk about some GBR fundamentals, their role in the contract, how they're intended to function, and then focus on the 2022 publication that has just come out a month or 2 ago. And then and I'll talk about the task committee and the degree to which we engage the industry, because these are industry publications, not the opinions of a few select authors. Then I'll talk about some of the key additions and enhancements since the previous edition in 2007, and then draw with closing comments and open it up to questions. So historical perspective, taking a line out of Barbra Streisand's song, The Way We Were. In the 1970s, owners of underground projects attempted to transfer the ground risks to the contractor. The operating message was, you bid it, now you build it. And here's the data, and make your own interpretations of what the ground conditions will be, and you carry the risk. And as you might imagine, in a competitive bid environment, contractors bid optimistically. And when costs exceeded their bid costs, they filed differing site condition claims. And the world began to revolve around the construction claims monthly, where you heard the results of various arbitrations and court cases. And what we found was litigation was spiraling, and it led to bad publicity for the owners because they weren't getting their jobs completed on time, and poor financials for the contractors. A lot of them got out of the business, or went bankrupt altogether. Not a good sign. And so we realized that in the tunneling industry, if we didn't stop the spiraling of litigation, people would find different products to purchase and would not build their systems with underground work because of the phenomena associated with them. To stop the litigation, the industry produced several research reports. One in 1994, one in 1984. These were under the National Academy of Sciences, U.S. National Committee on Tunneling Technology. And then the Underground Technology Research Council was formed under the American Society of Civil Engineers in those days called the Construction Division. Now it's the Construction Institute. But they developed a document in 89 and then a quick update in 91. And all of these documents pointed toward 4 improved contracting practices that needed to be implemented to reverse this trend in litigation. One was a differing site condition clause in the contract. Another was a geotechnical design summary report in the contract. Escrow bid documents by the selected bidder, not necessarily a contract document, but made available and held in escrow. And then a dispute review board. And these 4 were the cornerstone items that the industry felt would be critical to implement if we were to change the current conditions. Well, the industry said, well, we really need a document on dispute review boards, and some names on this effort. This was the beginning of this Dispute Resolution Board Foundation. This is where it all began. I remember being involved in the late 80s and early 90s on how should a DRB form. The very first DRB was in 1972 on the Straight Creek Tunnel on Interstate 70 in Colorado. But with growing credential and statistics, very, very positive statistics, this manual was developed, and now its version is obtainable for free on the DRBF website. Well, another item they said was, well, we really need to have a document on these geotechnical reports. In those days, we called them geotechnical design reports. And for a lot of reasons, we changed the name of the document. And I raised my hand and said, okay, I'll lead a committee. And we published 3 different sets of guidelines. One was the version in 97 was the first. The second was 10 years later that has earned a reputation globally as being the Gold Book, and one that's just been published in the last month or 2. And there's a strip of silver at the top. Maybe we call it platinum, maybe we don't, but maybe we'll just call it the book. But that's the latest compilation of lessons learned, and I would say lessons learned and forgotten, but that's the latest and greatest. The reality is GBR use has grown internationally. These are just some of the areas around the world that are using geotechnical baseline reports. And as you can imagine, they're also using different forms of contract. The GBR is not a plug and play phenomenon. It has to conform with the general conditions of contract wherever the construction is being implemented. That's something that we touch on briefly, and I'll get to that a little bit later. The Emerald Book is something that was jointly produced by FIDIC and the International Tunneling Association. And the Yellow Book is Emerald Book's design build guideline. And the Emerald Book is a variation of the Yellow Book specifically for underground construction. And they require a collaborative geotechnical baseline report between the employer, we call them owners, and the design and construct team. So improved contracting practices, we've got the baseline report, we've got something called a geotechnical data report, the differing site conditions clause, the escrow bid documents, and the dispute review board. The geotechnical baseline report does not function and is not effective by itself. It's not a silo. It's not a pedestal. It demands the integration in development of the documents and also in the execution and resolution of disputes to ensure that each element in the contract does its job. And I'll say that the dispute review board is a critical element of ensuring that fair contracting is implemented, not just at notice to proceed, but throughout the work. Some of the fundamentals of GBR's owner's obligations. The owner owns the ground. The owner should expect to pay a fair price for the work required to be performed by the contractor for all the conditions encountered during the work, whether they are known at time of bid or not. And if we had X-ray vision, we could see the ground, we could assess all the risks, and we wouldn't have to worry about a differing site condition clause, but we don't have X-ray vision. Owners pay for the conditions known at time of bid through the contractor's bid prices. And they need to understand the importance of compensating the contractor for conditions encountered during construction that differ materially from those indicated in the contract. And it's not just the GBR, it can be in the payment provisions, it can be in the specifications. It varies with how the contract documents are developed. On the contractor's obligation side, the contractor owns the risks for all of the ground conditions and risks identified in the contract, including the GBR, the data, the specs, the payment provisions, etc. Contractors responsible for the means and methods and any events and impacts associated with those means and methods that are not related specifically to the ground conditions, workmanship, downtime for delays. And it's important that a contractor has every right to bid below the baseline, but they take on commercial risk in doing so. When the differing site condition circumstance arises, it's not what the contractor's bid price is reflected, it's what were the costs of the work as reflected in the baseline. And these have value not just in the contract, but in the bidding process. So for a contractor to receive a compensation under the DSE clause, number one, they've got to demonstrate that they reasonably relied on the contract indications. And the value of escrow bid documents is that for contractors who bid it fair and square, they value EBDs as a means for verifying what they base their bid on. They need to document the conditions that differed materially from those indicated. And they need to demonstrate that there were cost and or schedule impacts resulting from those DSCs. Those are the three chains in the process, and they need to meet every one of them. So it's not a risk-free proposition for the contractor to have a GBR on the job. There are a lot of responsibilities that the contractor continues to carry. Basically, the GBR it's a risk allocation document. You think about it as a line in the sand. On one side within the baselines is the contractor's risk, and then beyond the baselines is the owner's risk. And there are a variety of ways of managing those risks. Potential risks not in the bid can be addressed by forward pricing, allowances, provisional sums, and how we connect those clauses is a vital link that determines whether the contract forms and so that we're able to resolve disputes through a matter of contract administration, not dispute resolution. So the data report versus the baseline report. The data report is it's factual. It's all the information obtained during exploration and lab testing, boring logs, laboratory test results, photos of lab samples, etc. And no interpretation, just the data. On the baseline report side, it's the single contractual interpretation of the expected subsurface conditions. And it's a level playing field because all bidders bid the same set of conditions. There are physical baselines that talk about intrinsic properties of the ground and behavioral baselines that connect with the means and methods that the contractor implements during the construction. The GBR takes precedent over the GDR in the contract because the GBR can be based on matters other than just the data. I'll talk about that a little bit later. Some of the benefits, they're named here. Here's where we talk about the fact that if there's a geologic model that like a Horst and Graben system up in the peninsula in Michigan, that structural geology gives rise to vertical joints. Vertical borings are not effective or efficient means of detecting vertical joints, and it's very difficult to detect boulders, degree of contamination, obstructions. So there's an opportunity for the GBR to contain provisional baselines that go well beyond the data, and that's why the GBR takes precedent over the data report in the contract hierarchy. So other benefits are because we have a tool, the DRB can say, well, let's look at what was indicated in the GBR. What did the contractor price and how did the conditions encountered differ from those indicated? And hopefully there's less acrimony, stronger partnerships, particularly using design build, where we emphasize the importance of a collaborative GBR. And I'll talk about that in the contents of the updated publication. And there's less distraction from contentious work. There's also an opportunity to create baselines that are spatially oriented. Let's think of it as tunneling reaches, or maybe just a shaft or whatever. By ascribing discrete baselines for those conditions, you have a contingency fund that looks across the entire job. It gives the owner the opportunity to retire contingencies for specific areas of work as those elements of work are accomplished. So let's now turn to the new GBR publication. I got to tell you that the process that we went through was an intense one. It's the third time we've done it. We picked up on a lot of lessons learned from the first two. We developed a committee, and the first group were what we called the writing subcommittee, and they were a cross-section of individuals from the industry. And then we also had a review subcommittee, also a cross-section of individuals handpicked from the industry. And as you can see, it was a blended group of individuals, 4 owners, 3 contractors, 3 engineers, and 2 attorneys. And what was the update process? Well, we started in June and July of 2021, and we formed this committee, both the writing and the review subcommittees. In August through September, the writing committee primarily focused on what's broken. What do we need to fix? What should the elements be that we should frame to the very first working session where we outreach to the industry in a workshop that we had in conjunction with Cutting Edge Conference in November? They fed back on the items they felt were broken, what was working from the Gold Book standpoint, what wasn't working. But one thing that we found was that while well attended, there were some 65 attendees. They were primarily engineers. There wasn't enough feedback from owners and contractors. So during subsequent months, we had a specific outreach to specific owners and contractors and got their feedback. Based on that collective information, we wrote a manuscript, and then in March we sent it to the review committee for review. We took their comments in April, incorporated them, and then created an updated manuscript and distributed it to some 50 registration attendees to a workshop at the George Fox Conference in May. We took audio transcripts. We had, I received maybe 15 or 16 track change edits. We literally sent them the manuscripts in Word. And we said, how can we improve upon this manuscript? And we also sent a manuscript in PDF to the Construction Institute Board of Executive Board so that they could understand where we were going, because we needed their approval to publish at the end. In May and June of 2022, we incorporated the workshop comments. June was quite a grilling effort. We sent an updated version of the manuscript to the review committee again for final review. We incorporated their comments. We then sent that version to the Construction Institute Board of Directors, and we got their approval, and then delivered the final work product at the very end of June, beginning of July to ASCE. From that point, we began an editing and formatting effort, and that took a long time. And at the end of December, we published it. So in retrospect, it took us 13 months to extract feedback from the industry and produce the publication. And it took another 6 months for ASCE to publish it because they had strict formats. And it's an involved process, and it was fairly intense. Over those 13 months, we had conference calls every Monday, 13 months by standing order. And if we didn't need it, we canceled it, but it kept the metronome, the staccato version. And we think we've developed a fairly tight document. Table of contents. Al Matthews was one of my mentors. He's been he was a driving force in some of those early publications. He was a driving force in the creation of the Dispute Resolution Board Foundation. There's an annual award given in his name. He certainly deserves to have this dedication. These are the new chapters that have been created, or pieces of text. These are the chapters that have substantially been expanded, and these chapters have been updated. I've got to say that the amount of change that we've achieved between the gold to the platinum greatly exceeds the changes that we executed between yellow and gold. And so there's a lot more work that went into this effort. In chapter 1, I would say that the key message is budgeting for uncertainty. And we have this graphic in there. And really, the GBR is the consequence of a risk assessment strategy. We're finding that projects aren't implementing risk analyses sufficiently and thoroughly, but site investigations, lab testing, and whether you're doing a design build where you're creating a reference design or design bid build as a guideline design, you identify through a quantitative risk analysis what the likely events are that you expect to occur on the job. And those are the circumstances that are summarized in the geotechnical baseline report. How you fund that work is, let's call it a blue bucket. These are the known knowns, and whether it's a target price or it's a bid, that's where the contract is established around what we think we're going to encounter during the work. Well, there may be some elements in the work that are known to occur, but we don't know how much they're going to occur. Obstructions of man-made features, left over from past construction. This happens often in urban areas. Hyperbaric interventions, they're going to be necessary, but how many? And contamination. Disposal costs are horrendous impacts to the job. And we need to have a way of measuring and compensating the contractor for just how much contamination has to be handled, tested, and disposed of. So we set nominal baseline limits for these costly items. If we included conservative estimates, it might blow the blue bucket out of the water. So we set more nominal baselines, and we can set aside for these medium probability, high cost elements, provisional sums in a separate bucket. And those are the known unknowns. And the value is that those are only paid by the owner to the contractor if the limits, if the quantities are exceeded. The most important stage, I feel, in terms of overall understanding of our underground business is to conduct a quantitative risk analysis of the unlikely events. And it's just not my opinion. Everybody, this really rang the bell with everyone saying this needs to be done. It's not being done, and it can cause a greater awareness of what's happening if we do it. So these are the unlikely events likely to occur. These are low probability, potentially high cost. And whether we look at it a P50 or P95, the consummate cost of dealing with those high cost items is built into a contingency fund. And that is the unknown unknowns that can only be discovered during construction. Again, as for the provisional sums, they are paid only if conditions are encountered. Now, this is the punchline, is that some owners feel that the blue bucket is their budget. In reality, all three buckets need to be their budget. We're finding that if owners participate in the risk analysis of unlikely events, and they understand what the contingency fund is there for, they've accounted for it. When it comes to paying a claim, it's not viewed as a loss, it's viewed as a cost. And I think it doesn't need to be any more complicated than that to understand that the ground conditions are what we know at time of bid and what we encountered during construction that we didn't know at time of bid. If we can manage our process this way, hopefully we require fewer dispute review boards and other elements of dispute resolution. So chapter 5, preparation of a geotechnical baseline report. We provide a suggested outline that I'll show you. There's a concept of trying to shrink the size of the GBR. It should not be a master's thesis, it should be short and snappy so that contractors can understand it quickly. Focus on the construction. Design matters are not typically the drivers of claims, which is why we changed the title of the document from Geotechnical Design Summary Report to Baseline Report for Construction, parenthetically. Organize the physical baselines in a logical, efficient, and visual manner. And we're finding that if we assemble GBR writing teams with the right experience, the right expertise, the right qualifications, and result in a better work product, we'll have less disagreement about what the GBR intended to convey. And I'll talk about that a little bit later as well. So this is the outline that is suggested in the guidelines, and it's based on dozens, if not hundreds of GBRs that have worked. This is a very efficient technique that's worked for simple projects and the most complicated transit projects. This is the challenge. We recommend page counts because we found that GBRs are being written by people who seem to emphasize being repetitive, redundant, and duplicative, if you get my point. Say it once, say it the best way you can, and cross-reference from there on. Those first 5 chapters should take no more than 7 pages. The ground characterization, depending on the complexity of the geologic setting, can take anywhere from 12 to 17 pages. If they're taking 30 pages, they're writing a thesis. And it's a good cross-check to saying, trim it back. Don't restate what's in the geotechnical data report. Just focus on the stuff that's critical on the job to resolving disputes. We don't need to baseline Poisson's ratio. We don't need the baseline modulus of subgrade reaction. Those are design parameters, and we can baseline those types of parameters elsewhere. But this area focuses on what elements of the ground will most influence the construction. Previous relevant construction experience is critical, 2 to 4 pages, depending on how evolved the environment is for tunneling construction. Construction considerations is really the behavioral phenomena tied to means and methods, and depending on, again, the complexity of the ground and the different components of construction to be implemented, this can run from 10 to 15 pages. Instrumentation and monitoring is simply 1 page. There's a mechanism for monitoring the ground and the structures, and see specification blank for details. The GBR is not the place to restate what's already in the specs. You divert and refer to the drawings as well. Spoil, groundwater, and gas management. These are very critical environmental aspects. 2 to 3 pages to cite what criteria being used for disposal of contamination, groundwater, discharge to local sewer systems, etc. So all told, 34 to 47 pages of text plus figures, tables, and charts. This is quite manageable. We just implemented a very complicated P3 project under Queen Street in Toronto. It's the part of the Ontario line, and I believe that the page count was something like 42 pages. It doesn't need to be a tome. It can be short and snappy, and this will help authors and reviewers of documents guide to be sure that we pare this down to just the essentials. So present baselines once without repeating. How can we do this? We need to write descriptions once, then cross-reference them. Physical baselines are most effectively conveyed visually. I'll show you an example. There are geologic profiles. We can have soil gradation curves. We can have histograms. These are very visual. And when it comes to physical and behavioral baselines, we can have a single table, which I'll show you later, where we're consolidating the physical and the behavioral all on 1 piece of paper. One of my first boss was Arthur Chase with the A.A. Matthews Company, and he said, put everything you know on 1 piece of paper. That's the mantra, and it works. Group strata and ground types by engineering classes. We find that baselining according to geologic nomenclature doesn't work. A good example on the Beacon Hill project, there were 27 different strata that could have been baselined, whether it was Vachon, pre-Vachon, these are glacial deposits. We were able to consolidate those 27 different strata into 6 different engineering classes, and we baselined them. And we can include the geologic formation nomenclature within the engineering class definitions. That's certainly possible. And what you find out is you can have more than 1 geologic stratum behaving in a like manner. And the kind of stuff that controls ground behavior during construction is not what name we gave it in the geologic storytelling. It's how do we expect the ground to behave. So this is an example of a project, a different project we did for a transit job in Toronto. And in the first column is the engineering class. The colors are coincident with the geologic profile. We provide a material description of the engineering class. Here's a connection to the geologic nomenclature to see what in materials associate with those behaviors, with those materials. And then these columns are describing what the anticipated behaviors will be, either in the subaqueous condition that's pressurized, or in the open air condition where just gravity is controlling. And this table may be more than one sheet, but the value is in the geotechnical baseline report. Rather than restating a baseline, it says see table 4-1 for the baseline statements, and they're all here. And there are graphs that show material properties physically, and it's perfectly acceptable here in the physical characteristics to reference visual characteristics of material properties. And here's an example of one for soils, where SPT blow counts, grain size distribution, plasticity, moisture content. Here's an old version of Marcus Thevis's clogging potential. There's a later version of it. But the beauty is for multiple strata to have the same information for each soil class presented in the same geographic concept. You begin to learn the differences between one stratum and another simply by looking and comparing the histograms and the charts, table to table to table. You can do this also for rock characteristics. Here's one for baseline parameters for engineering classes that are of indurated materials. And in this case, we baseline 3 different reaches along the job. So we had baseline histograms for RQD in reach A, B, and C. We had fracture frequencies for reaches A, B, and C. In situ UCS values, moisture contents, various characteristics that may be relevant to the types of rock we're dealing with. And again, each rock formation or each engineering class can be stacked in the same fashion so that we develop a visual mechanism. Using these tables probably saves, I'll say, 5 to 7 pages of text and maybe 20 pieces of paper in the document. And so I think it shows value. Put it on one piece of paper. It's going to be a lot easier for people to understand and integrate and price. So baselines can also be sentences. And these are warnings of anticipated behavior in the construction considerations. The soft ground soils can be expected to exhibit flowing conditions if balancing face pressures are not maintained by the EPBM at all times. I mean, that's a risk transfer. This ground will be unstable, and there'll be consequences if that instability is able to manifest. There's a couple of others here, but in time, I'll move on. But there are plenty of examples that can pop up, and there are some in the case history section at the end of the publication. This is where there was a Dispute Review Board Foundation workshop at the RATC in 2021, and one of the conclusions from that workshop was, if we could write better GBRs, we'd have fewer disputes. And it all begins with having a multidisciplinary team participate in the writing of the GBR. It starts with an engineering geologist who understands the geologic setting, conceive of a ground model of what the geologic conditions will be on a micro scale and a macro scale. Some of these features may not be detectable by investigation, so it's valuable. The geotechnical engineer is one who deduces the ground characterization from exploration and develops these parameters, and is also able to connect those parameters to other elements of the specifications. The construction specialist needs to weigh in on understanding the equipment, the means and methods, and the diverse ground behavior and conditions that will have to be overcome. Elements like gas, obstructions, contaminations, sensitive facilities are all critical in understanding what tools the contractor has to bring to the job and what risks need to be described in the geotechnical baseline report so they gain an appreciation in what is a fairly short tender period. The designer takes this information and makes sure that there's effective connectivity between what's written in the GBR and what's written in the specifications and shown on the drawings. Third-party constraints, payment provisions. The key is contract compatibility. And if you can resolve the compatibility between these among these different contract documents, you're probably eliminating 3/4 of your risk. One key concern, just because geotechnical is in the title does not mean that the GBR should be written solely by a geotech. And where we have this go on is owners say, well, we're going to have this geotechnical consultant do the exploration, and they're going to write the geotechnical baseline report. That is not a workable scheme. You have to have one who's developing the design understand how to connect the GBR to the specs and what construction constraints are imposed, because they may limit certain means and methods. That element also has to be in the GBR. It can't just be written by the geotech. The GBR must be prepared and reviewed by professionals with the right competencies and the right experience. And this is pretty heavily reinforced in the guidelines. Delivery of alternatives. One thing that's going south in this industry is owners like to use design build, but they're not really implementing design build. Design bid build is rarely being used, but in one workshop, I asked the question, is design bid build dead? And the response was no, because we really know what we're getting. So we've got to get back on the rails to understand for design build what's required. And the same rules that apply to design bid build should apply to design build as well. You really shouldn't start the GBR preparation until more than 50% of the site and lab data is in hand. Another is you don't issue a notice to proceed for construction until site exploration is substantially completed and reflected in the GBR. This idea of providing principally design-focused exploration to develop a reference design and then telling a contractor and design build after award to implement its exploration program is doomed to failure. And there are a number of projects in the past and go on right now where claims are raging because of new indications that were found in post-award site exploration programs. GBR should reflect the actual equipment, means, and methods that the contractor intends to use. Not having the owner guess at what might happen. That doesn't work. The two pass in the night. If the GBR focuses on one set of means and methods and issues and the contractor bids something totally separate. The key differences between design bid build and design build are aligned primarily by who employs the designer. For design bid build, the designer works with the owner and they wind up with a very strong relationship, and there's a very effective link between what the owner's risk profile is and what goes into the documents as managed by the designer. The GBR needs to reflect the bidder's input during procurement as well. And you can have RFIs, and there needs to be a willingness for the owner to adapt and modify and resolve ambiguities raised in the procurement process for design bid build. For design build, the designer does not work for the owner, and they may have a poor or non-existent relationship. It may be strained because there's a three horses in the design build race. Yet the owner seeks the full design risk transfer. There's other elements that go on with that risk transfer that have to be understood, and it's not going to be well understood because the owner really doesn't get to talk to the engineer about what they're thinking. There's also a poor link between the owner and the contractor. The GBR helps fill this gap. It requires close collaboration between the owner's initiation of the GBR and the design build team during the tender process. So having a collaborative GBR developed is described for a number of different delivery methods in the guidelines, and it really follows a lot of the virtues that the FIDIC Emerald book reinforces. And there are variations on the theme in the guidelines, ECI, CMAR, GMCM, these are all with the owner employing the engineer. And their variations on the theme for how you get the construction manager and the contractor on board earlier in the process so that you can have this interaction. On the design build side, we reinforce that progressive design build is a huge step forward. There are a couple of success stories going on right now in the industry. There are a couple of big projects that are in process in North America, all looking at progressive design build. And I think we're going to result in fewer disputes and a better understanding of work implementation if progressive design build is utilized, where you pick the contracting partner much earlier in the process and partner with that contracting team through the procurement effort. How did I wind up with baselines can be sentences? That's interesting. Anyway, chapter 7, applications for other excavations and foundations. This is conveyed in the images on the screen. We found that there are other things that are subject to claims other than tunnels and shafts, and chapter 7 enforces that benefit. These are some of the issues that are identified. It's a 3-page table. We look at baselines for open cut pipelines, earthworks, driven piles, drill shafts, slurry walls, ground freezing, tiebacks and anchors, scaling of ground slopes, horizontal directional driven. Microtunneling is addressed as tunneling, but this HD is a little different, spelled out here. Dams and levees, and grouting, which is permeation grouting versus jet grouting. They're two different phenomena, and their successes are dependent on two different pieces of information. So that's chapter 7. Chapter 8 is an involved effort. I think it's going to be a best read by everyone because it gets into a lot of the nitty-gritty that begins to contrast our form of contract in North America versus other forms of contract elsewhere in the world, and how you address variations or different site condition claims is different, and therefore GBRs are not a plug and play, and GBRs cannot be the sole basis for determining what is foreseeable. This term foreseeable is a trip hazard, and it exists in NEC 3.4, in ICE contracts, in FIDIC, and more work needs to be done to perceive that the GBR is not the sole indicator of what the baseline conditions will or will not be. It's the contract. There's other elements in the contract documents. What if the GBR is silent on a particular condition? The text addresses these issues. Causation. What establishes the material difference? These are some of the topics that are addressed. So it's going to be an interesting read. We didn't talk about these types of issues before to this degree of specificity. It's going to be a benefit. Recent practices, lessons learned. This is where I'm saying that the DRB Foundation in 2021 talked about the fact that if we could write better GBRs, we'd get better outcome. Why are GBRs decreasing in quality? And what needs to be done to reverse the trend? Owners in their design build delivery are not implementing design build the way they were intended. Issuing 120% reference design and saying you can't change anything is not design build. What needs to be done to reverse that trend? There are some undesirable practices that are going on in North America, and we talk about some of them. You can find them in the document. Some of them implemented in Canada are illegal. They're against the law according to federal acquisition regulations. Some interesting dynamics are going on when owners or their counsel are trying to transfer risk unnecessarily. Finally, there's an appendix that's brand new to this edition. There are 18 case histories, and what we're trying to do is to demonstrate the intent to provide examples of real disputes and how they were resolved considering GBR baselines and statements, as well as other indications in the contract. So the Platinum book is now available. If you Google it, you'll find that ASCE's book department has an access for both a soft cover book and an ebook version. And you can also find this for sale on Amazon, both in a paperback and a Kindle. From my understanding is Kindle is in Kindle speak. It's not the same as a PDF. but you do obviate the need for shipping costs. So that's where we are. At this point, I'd like to open it up for questions, and I thank you for your attention.
That was great, Randy. Thank you so much. And we do have quite a few questions that have been put in the Q&A box. So since you were just talking about the the Platinum book, one of the questions is, could you mention the differences, if any, between the Platinum book and the new CIR IA guidelines? So any differences?
Yes, the Syria C807 is a document that it actually has been contemporaneous with the Platinum book, and I'm a co-author of that document as well. The focus primarily, it's not on GBR philosophy, it's on how you utilize the GBR in a contract that has a variations clause where the term foreseeable is being used. Where the problems with the FIDIC book is that the FIDIC defines that the GBR declares that which is foreseeable. Well, what we're having is we're having people say, well, the reverse of foreseeable is unforeseeable, and attendant to unforeseeable is claimable. You surprised me. Well, as I said, there can be circumstances in the specs or the payment provisions where those are the indications in the contract. And I can give you some examples if we had more time, but that's what the Syria document focuses on is the forms of contract, NEC 3.4, ICE, the Emerald book, dealing with how we interpret the term foreseeable versus indications in the contract. There's a lot more text given in that document to how we write baseline statements. There's a lot more discussion in that document as to the relevance of developing of a ground model, and goes from the conceptual to analytic. We didn't spend that amount of time on the engineering side of it, but engineering geology side of it, but those are some of the differences. But right. I would say that the themes and the philosophies are the same.
Very good. Thank you. Well, we have another question in the Platinum book realm. So this one comes from our colleague, Joe Gildner, up in the Pacific Northwest. He asks, hey, Joe. For traditional design build delivery versus progressive design build, does the Platinum book provide any updated guidelines for owners on how much geotechnical data they should consider providing to support their RFP documents in the design build procurement phase and ahead of NTP with the selected design build contractor?
Only briefly. We decided not to get into the nuances of different delivery. There's a committee operating right now under the UCA of SME, and that would be an ideal document to publish in the industry to say, what are the recommended forms of contract delivery, which work best, which don't, what needs to be done for each. We decided not to go down that avenue. Otherwise, we would have added 10 pages to the document. And so the focus was on the GBR. In terms of levels of site exploration, what we have found is the early information that owners are gathering relative to design build reference design are focusing more on the layouts and the configurations of the elements to be built. And we find that the construction behavioral aspects, the strengths, the instabilities are not as well developed. So either substantially enhance the amount of site exploration at the RFP stage to capture the kinds of stuff the contractor is going to need to bid the work, or their subs are going to need to price the work, or provide more time to have the design build teams tell you what they want in the way of exploration, go out and implement that exploration, and then capture it and revise the GBR in a collaborative fashion so that at NTP or at point of contract award, we've got substantially all the data that's going to be gathered for the job. It carries design, it focuses on design issues and constructability issues. And we've gained the input of the design build teams based on a complete exploration program.
All right, thank you.
And that piece is mentioned in the text.
Very good, very good. All right, I'm going to go to the first question that came in from Connor Langford. He asks, is there any suggestion on what is meant by medium probability? Typically, this would be project, sector, owner, location specific, but wasn't sure if any general trends came out in your discussions.
No, nothing specific. I would say that whether the need to set provisional sums aside or include them in the blue bucket wants to be a decision that the owner makes with their advisor. Their advisor of design build and their engineer of record of design bid build. And you decide how you want to balance the compensation model. It may be more effective to trim the quantities to those conditions that you feel certain are going to be encountered, recognizing through the provisional sums that if those quantities are exceeded, the contractor knows it's going to get paid for the work it has to perform, but he's not carrying that level of contingency for those higher quantities in the blue bucket. So it's a separate mechanism. The value, by the way, of having these two subordinate buckets is that the owner may wind up, hopefully, substantially underrunning those non-paid items. There's a huge opportunity to reestablish the incentive process if the owner is to announce that any unspent monies from those second two buckets will be shared with the contractor at the end of substantial completion of construction in a ratio depending on some metrics, safety, meeting of intermediate milestones. I think it's going to change the behavioral phenomenon of the contractor. The contractors want to get it. Contractor might want to go after that money and get it in the way of claims, in which case they're buried in the cost of the project. But if they focus on, let's not worry about the claims, let's get to the finish line and do a good job, they might just collect a handsome completion bonus. Let's see if we could, and there are a lot of owners who are looking at this right now, create a carrot, not a stick.
All right, very good. So the next question comes from Oscar Cortez in Mexico. He asks, what is the risk considerations and transfer of the GBR in alternative development projects such as P3, DB, and CMCG? What are some examples of DRB's recommendations?
Oh, you'd have to defer to someone who's sat on those boards. But from my standpoint, in terms of managing ground risk, there really is no difference between design build and P3. P3 is simply design build with a mechanism for private financing and perhaps operations and maintenance. But they don't relate to the ground. They may carry some huge risks, but they're not ground related. I think that the recommendations that we have that we've put forward for design build and progressive design build are quite applicable to P3 as well. But I really wouldn't have the body of information. Perhaps someone else on this call would be better informed about what dispute review board decisions have been, but I believe they're going to implement the same fundamental objectives. You've got indications, you based your bid on it, show me that you relied on those that information, and we'll pay you fairly for the extant cost and schedule adjustments if there's merit. I think those principles shouldn't waver, whether you're going from contract administration, contract form A to B to C. I think I'll leave it at that.
I think you're right. You know, the DRBF does have a P3 task force that is looking at the use of dispute boards for those projects. And, oftentimes people say exactly what you've said, during the construction phase, there's nothing's magical or special or different about the application of dispute boards there. But there are sometimes in the financial end of it and the O&M piece that you talked about, maybe that make it a little bit different. And that's why we're looking at it from a big picture perspective and trying to give some guidance. As for Oscar's question about examples, there's limited data. There's limited use of dispute boards on P3s right now. We're gathering what we can. We've just done a study in the US, which gave us some useful data, and that is available in our DRBF library. So people should take a look at that as it relates to P3s. We can move on now. Another question coming in from Garth Wilson. How do the authors of a DBR know what means and methods are going to be used by the bidders?
Yeah, that's a large portion of one of our chapters, is that the owner and its advisor shouldn't be in the business of guessing what means and methods and layouts and configurations are going to get built. You've got to give time for the proponents to provide those opinions. And owners, on a job on the Niagara Power Tunnel, it was a public works project. It happened to be the largest open main beam TBM in the world at the time, but we had 3 different teams with different means and methods. There was a bespoke GBR for each one of them. One was tied to a 2-pass lining system, and other versions were tied to a 1-pass lining system. But the GBR content needs to seek the same risk profile that the owner intends to achieve, whether the contractor is bidding construction methodology A or B. There may also be modifications in components. We had an instance on a CSO tunnel project where if the owner would have been able to allow the relocation of a drop shaft, the contractor could have used it as a non-hyperbaric intervention mechanism, and it would have saved lots of money. And for some reason, the owner said, no, I can't change that. Well, how about the connection of that drop shaft to the tunnel? It's not baseline. And we'd like to propose what our methods are going to be and what our assumed conditions are going to be. And they weren't allowed to put that into the GBR either. This is the example of where owners are conceiving of design, build, delivery, but they're implementing their business as if it were design, bid, build, as if it's prescriptive and you can't change anything. That's why we're saying progressive design build helps us leave that behavior behind. And let's engage the contractor, listen to what the means and methods are, and find a way to incorporate their intentions into the GBR. So both parties are contributing language that becomes the GBR to the contract.
Interesting. All right. Well, listen, Randy, we're feeling the love here today on Valentine's Day. We've got 1 minute left and 4 questions. So I wanted to ask, are you willing to stay on for a few minutes and get to the end of our question list?
You bet.
All right, great. Well, if anyone needs to sign off, we are recording today's session. We'll record all the way to the end of the questions, and we'll send out a link and share that recording so you can rewatch and catch any questions that you might miss at the end. But we'll persevere through. Our next question comes from Carl. He asks, does the book address the role or desirability of reference documents?
Yes. This in one specific area, people are baselining design parameters. There doesn't need to be a baselining of design parameters in the GBR. There's another document that we recommend, and it's been recommended in the yellow and the gold book. There can be something called a geotechnical memorandum for design. If the geotech wants to convey certain opinions to the designer, or if the two of them want to convey certain options that could be implemented to the owner based on variable ground conditions or configurations, what have you. A geotechnical memorandum for design is something that talks about the design development phase, and in past practice, I recommended that those documents not even be finalized, leave them in draft, but make them available so that people can see how we got to the project configuration that is either being designed or is one of the top ranked version of the reference design that's being shown. Full disclosure is important in our business, and showing reference documents and the bases for reference design are appropriate, but not as contract documents for information only. And that is talked about.
All right, great. Our next question is from Michael Gennaro, asking what percentage of public owners hedge on the concept of risk allocation by transferring more risk to contractors than ideally anticipated in the Platinum Book?
You know, I guess the best way I can answer that is there's a poster child project, and it's the Ottawa Light Rail project. And the owner went P3 and said, oh, by the way, since we're transferring design risk, we're going to transfer ground risk also. And they did it in a unique manner, and it's discussed in the book. At the end of the day, the contractor carried all ground risk. The owner perhaps was less attentive than they should have, and they enjoyed a massive SEM, large diameter collapse in Center City. Hundreds of millions of dollars of claims ensued. And my comment is, wow, you were really effective in transferring your commercial risk. How well did you transfer your reputational risk? Whose name wound up on the front page of the newspapers? I mean, managing risk goes beyond the commercial. And there's something that maybe it's not the owners, but the owner's general counsel who think they can be a little more clever in implementing something with circuitous reference or whatever, but underground is different. It's not like a building. It's underground, and Mother Nature's schizophrenic, and fair, transparent contracting is the best way forward. And having a DRB mechanism that is able to resolve any disputes that do arise within the time footprint of construction is an essential deterrent to magnanimous claims. But this business about, let's just call it P3 and transfer all the ground risk, they've done this in Australia. And there are no more Australian contractors left to bid the work. Owners in Australia are finally growing up to the idea of maybe we need some risk allocation documents. Maybe what the rest of the world is doing will work, because what we're doing isn't.
We just had a conference in Brisbane a couple of months ago, and you're absolutely right. That is a big issue in Australia right now.
I mean,
let's move on. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say some people consider CPB and John Hall, when I was Australian, they're both owned by the Chinese. There, lots of great contractors have gone by the wayside in Australia because of these you bid it, you build it agendas. And oh, by the way, here are the 7 borings as a basis for your bid. We now ask you to drill the next 45 borings in the implementation of your work, even though you've signed the contract today. You can expect what's happened, and unfortunately, it's a poster child for things that really should change. So, Mike, it's a good question.
All right. Well, now I'm going to bring one from David Chesser. So, from your workshops and forums leading up to this new edition, were there any particularly memorable conclusions on how DRBs can be more effective and satisfactory for all parties? He says, I've heard from some owners that they weren't happy with their DRB and preferred to go to arbitration and mediation because they valued the mediator's experience more than the DRB's experience in construction. The mediator's experience in mediation versus the DRB's in construction. Any reflections on that?
In the early days, as a DRB member that was voted in and then voted off because I resisted. The owner would pick a member. The contractor would pick a member. They'd be mutually agreed upon, and the two would select the third. And in some cases, there were individuals nominated who maybe weren't as objective as they could have been. And if there's one of the three members who is not objective, it ruins the process. And with time, the process of saying, well, why don't we identify 5 individuals? The owner identifies 5 and the contractor identifies 5. And then in a workshop environment, not an exchange of letters, but in a workshop environment, they pick the 3 optimum members. And to me, that's also has value because it's like a 3-legged stool. My feeling is that you want someone who knows the ground conditions, someone who knows the construction aspects of the business, and the other has a cost estimating background. They have to get into quantum. Those 3 legs of the stool, I think, are inherent in a high-performing DRB. I don't think legal expertise and mediation style should be a criterion. We're trying to build the job successfully without claims, rather than worry about how we're going to deal with the damages afterward. And I think that having 5 and 5 combined to 10 and evaluate the 10 gives you a greater opportunity to find the 3 best solutions, also mutually agreeable. You're not rejecting anybody, you're selecting someone. And I think it gets, and that's in the DRB Foundation guidelines now, but some owners like to do it the old way. And I think there's an improvement there that should be held. But I think step 1 is get a quality board together who is mutually agreed upon, has the right skills, and you know they're going to be objective. And then the 3 of them decide who the chair is. I think that's a step in the right direction.
I couldn't agree more, Randy. So I appreciate you emphasizing that. It really has become a best practice. And we see so often when there's concerns, it does go back to that member selection. And it's really a crucial piece of the puzzle. So thank you for emphasizing that. Joe Claire's got a question. This updated guideline seems to be directed to the US-Canada market. Do you see this applicable to the international market? And if so, what differences might be called out?
Yes, it is directed to North America. We knew that the Syria publication was being developed. I helped review a New Zealand guideline in 2020. And I think when in Rome, as the Romans, and there are tweaks. To me, they are the form of contract that the owner wants to utilize, and whether they're using the term foreseeable, whether they're talking about a variations clause, making sure that the GDR is a contract document, because if the GBR is silent on a condition, you can defer to the data as being part of the contract. For a variety of reasons, the GBR takes precedent. These are the subtleties that will differ as you go from Europe to South America, Australasia, New Zealand, Australia, Singapore, Hong Kong. They all have their preferences. Very difficult to capture all of that stuff in a guideline, but yeah, no, we said, let's just focus. There's enough food on our plate to deal with just North America. And we decided that ought to be the scope of this document. It shouldn't be all things to all people, but I think the principles are directly applicable. And the fact that the Gold Book has seen dissemination around the globe. In fact, I've got 2 versions of the Gold Book that were translated into Japanese, because and that's a point that I failed to make, is that ASCE book department will have the GBR guidelines publication translated into different languages, and there's a means to do so. So if someone wants Spanish or French or German, there's a mechanism to work with ASCE to have a translated version, which is very important in certain conditions of contract. Owners only want to work with the language they're familiar with, and they don't like rudimentary translation. We had that problem on a Codelco project in Chile, where they went with the wrong form of contract because it was already in Spanish. And it was a square peg in a round hole. Subtleties.
Yeah. That's an interesting point. The DRBF's manual is currently being translated into official Spanish and Portuguese editions for the launch of our international conference in Sao Paulo later this year in early June. And yes, it is important to make sure you get a quality translation for, the proper understanding of these complex issues. And also, I would say that one of the things we say about the dispute board process is that there is so much that is similar around the globe, and there's a lot to eliminate in those commonalities and how the process, the foundational principles, as you mentioned, are the same everywhere. But there are tweaks, and you do have to acknowledge those and address those so that people can use these tools effectively in their various countries and the ways that they work on these projects. And it's different sometimes when you're having everyone on the project is Chilean, or it's a multinational project where you have companies coming from all over the globe. We do have one final question from Armando Tamay asking, can GBR and beam forecast of rock at front before the excavation or similar be used during excavation to avoid as much disputes as possible?
I'm not sure I've under GBR and beam.
Beam, and then in parentheses, forecast of rock at front before the excavation.
FIDIC does this. All right, so FIDIC
might be where that's coming from, yeah.
Yeah, the FIDIC Emerald book says, let's take the ground conditions, and this is more applicable to drill and blast or some form of sequential excavation where you see the ground, you're installing the supports round by round, drift by drift, and you can adapt and react to. They want to baseline ground classes for payment provisions and talk about what the production rates will be in those ground classes, what the lining requirements will be consequent to those ground classes, price those. And this is where we begin to diverge in opinion. In effect, monetizing everything the contractor does gives the owner per FIDIC the right to underpay the contractor if the conditions are better than were indicated in the baselines. It's not the question that was being asked, but it's a subtlety that if it's a cost reimbursable contract, go for it. But if there's commercial tension at time of tender, the flip side of a contractor's risk is the contractor's profit. And I can remember an enlightened industry workshop that we had in Los Angeles, where that issue was debated. And on a hard money contract, if the owner wants to allocate risk to the contractor, it's the pricing of the job captures those risks. And if those risks don't materialize, the owner is not entitled to a credit. If you want to pay as you go and have lots of provisional sums, that's a mechanism. But FIDIC does go that way. They try to monetize everything. And I've tried to thwart that discussion by saying, well, if the contractor is going to lose money by going faster, what stops them from simply slowing down? If it's more profitable to go slower and collect a greater fee, that's a decision the contractor is going to make. It's going to be very difficult for the owner to dispute or debate that phenomenon. But a lot of people who use FIDIC, World Bank has agreed to use FIDIC with the GBR concept for all their underground work globally. So some people believe that this can be managed, and maybe it's worthy of additional review.
Very good. Well, I really appreciate you staying on an extra 15 minutes and fielding these questions. I think they were great, and we're getting a lot of appreciation in the chat for taking the time to work through these questions. A lot of interest and engagement on this topic. So thanks again, Randy, for a great presentation. As I mentioned, we've been recording, and we will process the recording, get it posted online, and share a link with everyone who registered for today's webinar. And you're welcome to post that around with your colleagues who may have an interest in this particular topic. I think it's really been interesting, educational, and a great way to engage on this topic. And so I encourage you all to go and download a copy of the book and rewatch the video, and hopefully we'll see you at a future event. DRBF hosts both webinars, workshops, and conferences year-round, online in this virtual platform and in person. So go to our website, drb.org, check out the calendar of events, and we hope to see you again at a future event.
Thank you all. Thanks for the invitation.